Many thanks for having us here, and especially to Giulia and Zrinka for organising this event and inviting us to participate. It's wonderful to be in such esteemed company, speaking to you from the, as you say, the dark night of the Antipodean winter. It's also freezing cold here, which is probably also very different from California as well. The title of our presentation today is The Idea of Critical Antiquities. The germ of what we call critical antiquities began in 2019 and has informed a number of overlapping projects. The establishment of an international network of scholars, that is the Critical Antiquities Network that Giulia very kindly mentioned, a series of online workshops, an edited book on Marx and antiquity, and hundreds of conversations between Tristan and myself about how to articulate the relationship between antiquity and our present historical situation. At the beginning of 2022, the time seemed right to offer an articulation of our conception of critical antiquities, which we first delivered as a public lecture in February. Today, we will present a version of that lecture which we have modified in order to account for some of the reactions that it provoked, especially from Brooke Holmes, who generously responded to our lecture, and better to adapt it to the theme of today's workshop. In sum, today we will outline a set of guiding ideas for how the resources for critique can be found in the artifacts of the ancient past, ideas that are encompassed in our term critical antiquities.
So foremost in the critical antiquities approach are its key terms, critical antiquities. So here we're going to discuss those two key terms and then what results from their conjunction. So first of all, critical. Perhaps the simplest sense of critique is negation, but this ostensibly simple sense requires some unpacking. What allows us to negate something? Negation presupposes the existence of some kind of alternative possibility against which existing conditions can be understood as deleterious or deficient. Often, an alternative possibility is grounded in a mere suspicion that the existing can be done better. This may take the common form of an immanent critique that evaluates something's functioning from its own standards of success. Or it may take the form of a complete rejection on the basis of a desire for something completely different. So in this basic sense, critique is everywhere. I mean, who isn't able to engage in critique when they say their coffee is too bitter, or the air conditioning too cold, or their job too demanding? But this easy relationship between suspicion and critique shows why the idea of critique cannot stand in for critical theory as such. To conflate suspicion and simple critique with critical theory can only come from a misunderstanding or perhaps a too relaxed sense of critical theory itself. But more dangerously, it can stem from the self-satisfying seduction of suspicious critique that leaves untouched the conditions that produce the suspicion in the first place, as though transforming the existing conditions would be too onerous on ourselves, too difficult to undertake, if not impossible. So Ben and I contend that to engage in a critical theory is to do more than simply negate. Critical theory is distinguished by what we'll tendentially call scientific standards and a determinate goal. The determinate goal, put boldly, is transformation for the sake of human flourishing. The scientific standards can be captured in a question: does the engagement work for the goal? Now, what is this perhaps surprising appeal to science and scientific standards from some avowed critical theorists? We will elaborate on this as we turn to the next key term in our approach, antiquities. But at the outset, we can say a few things. First, these are scientific in as much as science is held to a pragmatic standard in the spirit of John Dewey. That is, there are goals and subservient methods that govern scientific practice, and these make its activities answerable to a community of practitioners. But second, the appeal to scientific standards further distinguishes our approach from that of suspicion and mere critique as negation. Life is, at any moment in time, manifestly determined. There are forces at work in and on our lives that are not contingent on our understanding of them. They exceed our ideas and actions, even while they are constituted through them. But life is determined by forces that must be understood if they are to be grappled with, and grappled with if they are to be negated in any meaningful sense. A rigorous understanding of these determining forces distinguishes critical theory from superstition and its conspiratorial modes of engagement. Critical theory's scientific standards are not to be confused with merely sophisticated or complex ideas. After all, suspicion can be just as elaborate when it becomes superstition. Suspicion and mere critique can easily grow into complex theoretical formulations such as conspiracy theory, and it is seductive. That said, there is something about the simple sense of critique and its suspicion that things could be otherwise, that we can retain for critical theory. But critical theory too is predicated on the capacity to think, act, and therefore become otherwise. Whence this capacity? We take this to be a natal capacity of human beings, stemming from our singularity. That means our thinking, our action, and our becoming are always underdetermined. But this is a capacity that cannot be proven as such. Our capacity to act otherwise is a concept without which we cannot engage in critical theory, and yet we cannot possibly exhaust or prove its determinate content. But if the goal of a critical theory is not to simply provide an objectively verifiable theory, but rather to think, act, and become otherwise, then we need not prove it anyway. Because since when was the precision or veracity of scientific demonstration a guarantee for praxis? This capacity for alterity rather has to be experienced phenomenologically to be accepted. And if it is to be experienced, it needs to be amplified or strengthened. And as our experience of it grows, so does the capacity itself. And as the capacity grows, so does critical theory's scientific or objective credentials as it becomes grounded in individual experience in a collective context. That is, the natal capacity to think, act, and become otherwise is answerable to this collective experience, another way in which the scientific standards we invoke govern our approach. We even advance the more radical claim that the exercise of this capacity for praxis is a component of human flourishing itself, a claim that again has to be individually experienced and collectively answerable to be tested. But how then is this capacity to think, act, and become otherwise to be amplified? Well, the turn to ancient traditions can assist with both tasks of critical theory as we've begun to elaborate it here. That is, first, to understand the determinate and historical qualities of human existence, and second, to amplify our ability to think, act, and become otherwise. And so critical theory simultaneously holds theory and the theorist to the standards of scientific practice and reflexive political praxis, where the easy negation of existing conditions is elevated to the transformation of existing conditions. It is these qualities of critical theory that we wish to outline here. Above all, however, it is our contention that these qualities are enhanced by a detour through ancient traditions. Together, these ideas form the basis of a critical antiquities approach, as Ben and I conceive it. So given the measure of success that we set ourselves, the question we need to answer is this: how does critical theory and critical antiquities work for the goal? Well, our answer lies in two theses, which we have kind of developed to orient our work. The first thesis, for praxis, ancient worlds must serve as both standpoints and objects of critique. And that is because of another thesis. That is, that there are worlds to re-encounter that hold out the possibility of othering ourselves in an emergent present.
And so now we turn to the second term in our critical antiquities diptych. So how can our understanding of human existence in A, its historical determinations, and B, our capacity to think, act, and become otherwise be amplified? Antiquities have a crucial role to play here. Antiquity as standpoint and antiquity as object of critique. Let's begin with an illustration of this from Joseph Conrad. In the opening pages of Conrad's Heart of Darkness, the River Thames is lauded for being a conduit of, quote, the dreams of men, the seed of commonwealths, the germs of empires. And then Conrad writes this: and this also, said Marlowe suddenly, has been one of the dark places of the earth. By so referring to the River Thames, the narrator of Heart of Darkness defaces its image by reframing it as the mysterious destination of Roman conquest, rather than the launching place for imperial ambitions. Conrad's critique of the modern imperial project stems from what is, at the outset of the book, a mere suspicion for which antiquity serves as a standpoint. Conrad, however, does not stop there. The entire book constitutes Conrad's effort to explore the mentalities of imperial domination that, in the case of Marlowe, turn inward in an inverted fashion. A signal contribution of Heart of Darkness is its dramatisation of the passage from suspicion to critique by focusing on the allure and seduction of superstition in the figure of Mr. Kurtz. In one sense, the darkness of the novel is a figure for both the expression of suspicion and the sterile attempt to protest against the contradictions that elicit it in the form of a brute repression. It is with this creeping elaboration of the process, narrated as Marlowe's catabasis, a descent into the darkness, that Conrad makes more profound suspicions turn to critique, and so presages a critical theory that promises to evade superstition. But as Roman imperialism was drawn on as a standpoint to illuminate modern conquest, it is also drawn into that critique to become part of its very object. Over the horizon of the novel is the possibility of a generalised critique, which will include Antiquities imperialisms as much of those of modernity. Indeed, the work holds out the possibility of becoming a critique of all imperialisms. That said, Conrad does not go far enough and opens himself up to critique in turn. As Edward Said argues, Heart of Darkness thereby opens itself up to become an object of critique in turn, as some of its orientalizing tropes fall foul of Said's illuminating, if far from watertight, decolonial critique. We too, in the Critical Antiquities Network and Project, treat ancient worlds as standpoints and objects of critique. The alterity of antiquity provides us with a standpoint from which to critique our present. Critical Antiquities seeks to understand ancient worlds in their alternative determinations through rigorous study and devoted attention to its artifacts. These artifacts testify to alternative forms of life, and especially alternative modes of thinking, acting, and being. But that is only insofar as they are not identical to the present and are yet available to the present. They are available to the present only insofar as we take them up, and we take them up only when there is a will to take them up in this way. At the same time, they are available in their difference only insofar as we, that is living, thinking, and acting subjects, are reflexive about the mediation of language, culture, history, values, and the scholar, insofar as we possess a self-reflexivity that can acknowledge and engage with alterity. In order for them to actually come to us in their alterity, the scholar is needed, because we have to treat them through the most developed and reflexive methods available: philology, history, philosophy. These are scientific practices insofar as they are answerable to a community of practitioners who can hold, for example, philological accountings for ancient artifacts to account, though we acknowledge, as do scientists predominantly, that this does not also mean a shared consensus. By science, then, we want to elevate this mode of practice that is especially at work in the STEM disciplines. We also, to be clear, want to diminish the term science from its positivistic pedestal and join those scientists who especially recognise the pragmatic nature of scientific research. That is, science that responds to the question, does it work? We invoke the language of science to express our aspiration to align ourselves with its answerability. In response to diminished notions in the humanities about the objectivity of interpretation, we hold to the fact that we need objects and we need standards by which we, that is to say, an expanded community of interpreters, evaluate our engagements with them, and even, and perhaps especially, when we are engaged in high theory. In saying that, however, we don't deny that the objects we wish to focus on in antiquity will change, and so what stands for antiquity itself, but we fix our mind on antiquities artifacts and so appeal to science, which also treats different objects and in different ways according to its own values. But we also recognise that the very thing that draws us to ancient objects is also the thing that complicates our engagement with them. That is, our attention to ancient objects comes from their value as a standpoint, a value that inheres in their difference from the present. But this very quality is also what holds the object at bay and threatens to make our efforts futile.
Supposing that we can grasp antiquities in their alterity, what can we do with them? Well, to begin with, by virtue of the alterity of ancient worlds, we can better account for the specifics of our own time and place to evaluate the present. That is, we can recognise the present's deleterious aspects and its laudatory ones. This requires understanding the present in addition to the past as manifestly determined, at least for the moment. That is, despite some of its emergent properties and fluctuations, we need to remand the present in some kind of historically specific pattern or paradigm that allows us to speak to its particularities, its particular determinations. But we need to go further than treat antiquities as standpoints for critique. Ancient worlds are also worthy of critique, based on the presupposition that all human life has negative aspects, whether that critique operates immanently or transcendentally. We thereby resist treating ancient worlds as refuges from the present or as things that we should pine for or attempt to resurrect wholesale in the present, if that were even possible. This critique of the past is not gratuitous. It's necessary because of the nature of our existence in the present. That is, we accept that the present is our standpoint for critiquing ancient worlds. We cannot in this instance do otherwise. But this critique is not done simply because the present is never simple. Yes, our present is determined in manifold ways, and our ability to critique it is contingent on that. It is especially the goal of the previous component of critical antiquities, the standpoint one, to take account of these determinations. But the present is also complex because it is itself emergent. To state only one dimension of its emergent status, it is emergent because of the human capacity to think, act, and become otherwise. Because of this capacity to become otherwise, it is crucial to be clear about what we wish to affirm in the present. That is, we are responsible for what we affirm in the present. And so critiquing the past is not about transforming that past. It is not about being smug about our more progressive present. It is about taking seriously the task we have to live reflexively and conscientiously. But why do we pluralize antiquities? Are we not classicists who are trained in the study of Greece and Rome specifically? Well, we do so because it is especially the alterity of the ancients that is of value to us in this conception. So there's no privileging of classical antiquity, that is Greece and Rome. But that said, there may be something strategically advantageous about looking at Greece and Rome that other antiquities do not share, namely their accessibility in our present condition. That is, they are already shared to varying degrees, which means there is a shorter leap from our critical project to the everyday person and their ability to orient themselves to ancient artifacts and undertake a critical project with them. And this idea of the everyday person is important because ours is also an avowedly radically democratic project. But what does this givenness of classical antiquity, of Greece and Rome, entail exactly? Well, in her response to the first delivery of this paper, Brooke Holmes pointed out that the difficulty of perceiving antiquities in their alterity is surely exacerbated, not alleviated, when we consider the givenness of Greek and Roman antiquities because of the so-called classical tradition. Why? Because these ancients are not characterized by their alterity, but rather their identity with the present. That is because Greece and Rome have been extensively captured by what the artist Paul Chan calls chronological time, where tradition is remade as, and I quote, a form of self-justification to naturalize the right to advance its rule in perpetuity, end quote. And what does this rule consist of? Nothing that a critical theory would want to affirm. Since classical antiquity was formed as, and I quote, this is Brooke Holmes, a contemporary object of value in the crucible of 19th century coloniality and empire and patriarchy, which means the classical helps blacken some humans, to take up Zakiya Jackson's term, that is, to mass orientalize what is not Greek and Roman, end quote. In response to the givenness of classical antiquity, Holmes and others have opted for a genealogical mode of critique, That is, in a move that is ostensibly inspired by and resembles Nietzsche's critique of Christian morality in On the Genealogy of Morals, and is definitely informed by Foucault's own kind of use of Nietzsche and the idea of genealogy. So genealogists of the classical tradition take the givenness of the classical tradition and seek to demonstrate the contingency and operation of power at work in this tradition's making and unmaking. And on this basis, it also counterposes an alternative genealogical study of classics. But I think there are problems with this too. First, a genealogical approach supposes that the artifacts that survive into the present are all tainted with the brush of Chan's supposed so-called chronological time. But this denies what the study of the classical tradition, especially within reception studies, has patently shown, which is the unevenness of what is valued from classical Greece and Rome and therefore stands as the classical tradition, and how the exemplars of the classical tradition change over time. So it's not stable. It's not simply the fact that everything that has come from Greece and Rome is part of the classical tradition. But there's another problem, and that is that the genealogical approach also supposes that all the people engaged with classical antiquity are tainted by this brush of the classical tradition too, which faces a number of differences that some of our speakers have already alluded to. That is, the study of classics in their national contexts. That is, American classics, British classics, European classics, Australian classics, Indian classics, to name just those pertinent to our conversation here so far. But this move also effaces the differences between the people within those countries too. That is, I doubt that the American Midwestern corn farmer has the same relationship to the artifacts of the past as does an Ivy League professor. So a genealogical approach has its place and function, but it is not the only way a critical antiquities or critical classics can proceed. And that is because we contend that the artifacts of classical antiquity exceed the construction and reconstruction of the classical tradition. That is, ancient artifacts, whether Greek, Roman, Indian, Chinese, Australian, Slavic, Mayan, or other, are themselves underdetermined. And that is in part because the availability of these artifacts, their givenness, is not isomorphic with the classical tradition. But what makes the artifacts of Greek and Roman antiquity relatively accessible is the fact that their texts and manuscripts sit in libraries. The study, teaching, and learning of their languages takes place in both universities and even, for now, some high schools. And the display and contextualization of their material remains, whether in artworks or quotidian household objects, is to be found in museums and books far and wide. So in contradistinction to this givenness, this accessibility, the givenness that is the starting point of the genealogical approach requires the drastic delimitation of what Greek and Roman artifacts are, and in doing so, circumscribes what they mean to people in the present. In doing so, the audience of the genealogical critique is an uncertainly defined set of academic classicists and lay people, past and present, for whom this critique will be urgent and searing. But in doing so, it undercuts what is often taken to be the reason for this critique in the first place, and is one of the ostensible reasons for us gathering here today, which is to consider what it means to study ancient traditions now in the face of a world that is increasingly indifferent and even hostile to them. By contrast, Ben and my critical antiquities approach is devoted to a third and crucial feature, and that is a praxeological orientation. That is, it is concerned about the action that is possible in the present, and so praxis is a third and implicit concept in the name of our approach, critical antiquities, that Ben will very briefly elaborate to conclude our presentation.
So as we turn to the end, we'll just say something short about praxis. In the dialectical movement between antiquities and the present, we seek the creation of another standpoint. It is an outcome of the ancient coming into contact with the present, and in that sense, perhaps a symptom, a symptoma of the meeting of ancient and modern standpoints. But unlike a threshold figure, such as a Gambin or a Deleuzian event as singularity, or a dialectical synthesis in the spirit of Hegel, we may remain agnostic about its novelty and simply submit that we seek a standpoint that we can claim as our own, that we can identify with, that we have chosen, and that we can subject to ongoing scrutiny. To think, act, and become otherwise proceeds out of the activity that pervades this treatment of antiquity and our present lives, and it crucially involves evaluation, judgment, and enactment, and that is, in sum, praxis. The truth is, the present is always our standpoint, but we attempt to use available methods and are open to those yet to be invented to try and other that present and to do it consciously. In all of this, we are self-reflexive about our own subjectivity in its situated state. By situated, we mean the complex combination of subjects in their environments, as again, John Dewey understands the term. It is both the identities and differences between ancient and present lives that informs the critical antiquities approach. And we thank you both of us very, very much.